Hey, it's future Luke here. And I wanted to say that, you know what's really embarrassing? When you realize 5 minutes into an interview that you aren't recording, and then you have to press the record button on your computer to be sure that you're recording an interview. But hey, this is the first interview I've ever done for Bowtie Talks. Let me tell you, it is a good interview. My guest for this episode is my friend Tiffany Brannan. She's an opera singer, Hollywood historian, writer for the Epoch Times, vintage fashion enthusiast, and conspiracy film critic, and she is extremely knowledgeable in all those fields. During the first part of the conversation, we were discussing an early film of Jack Lemmon, and the title was one that I'd forgotten. And then when I managed to press the record button, I said, "I've always loved the first. I've always loved the first movie that Jack Lemmon did. The one he did with Judy Holliday. What was it called?
It Should Happen to You.
That's it.
That's a great movie.
Yes, anyways, back to the Hays Code, but that's another thing I was going to ask you was when did you become aware of the production code, as you already said? And would you possibly explain the pre-code era? Because that was really when sound was in kind of its infancy, and that's an interesting genre of films, to say the least.
That's right. That term pre-code is used to define early talkies from around 1930 to 1934. Of course, there were a few talkies in like 1927 to 1930, but by 1930, almost all mainstream films were talkie, and it's sort of ironic that the term pre-code is used because in 1930 the production code was officially adopted, but it wasn't enforced properly because the Studio Relations Committee didn't have any power to enforce it. So you could call it rather the era in which they ignored the code. And during that time period of those 4 years, those movies are noted for having a high level of violence, a lot of risqueity, very indecent costumes, and they're very shocking if you believe that old movies were all decent and clean because it was the good old days. If you aren't familiar with those movies, it can be a bit shocking to see them, but because of that, many people really love them. They were made during that time, which was also prohibition, so there was a lot of gangster violence, which went along with bootlegging, and fast-paced dialogue, sort of witty, sarcastic banter, which just wasn't possible in silent movies. So that's just the pre-code film in a nutshell, that genre. But some of the greatest examples from that time are probably the gangster films like The Public Enemy, and then you have those pre-code musicals like Footlight Parade and Flying Down to Rio, 42nd Street.
Yeah, and another thing that really comes to my mind is the old Hal Roach movies, Laurel and Hardy in particular.
That's right.
Is they did, if I remember, it was their first sound short. I think it was called Unaccustomed as We Are, and they light a lady's dress on fire.
Yes.
Oh, you've seen that one?
I've seen that clip, not the whole movie.
And again, it's when they light the dress off, she's. I'm trying to think of a way to put this mildly. I don't want to say in a state of undress because that's not the right term. But yeah, she's less clothed. Let's just say that.
Yes.
And then, of course, in '34, that all changed.
Yes,
But
yes,
man,
it
those
did.
3 short years, it might be a bit shocking to some. And what's even more shocking is that I watched a documentary on the pre-code years, and they said that had the code not come along before it had, there may have been a nude scene much earlier in Hollywood history than there had been.
That probably is true. There were at least toying with nudity in many pre-code films. There are lots of instances of female toplessness, and perhaps not as graphic as it would be in the 60s, but one can only imagine how movies would have been by, say, 1940 if the code hadn't come along, because I doubt they would have just peaked out and stayed in that level that they were in the early 30s. You can definitely see a trend toward more and more shocking things because they were trying to outdo each other. Someone from the Production Code Administration, I believe, called it the race to the bottom. They were just trying to outdo one another. And the year 1934 is a bit of a juxtaposition because the first half of the year you still have pre-code films, but after July, the Production Code Administration had been formed, and then for the second half of the year, the movies are technically code films, and many of them are very much in line with the code, but In a good deal of these films, you can see that they are still recovering from the pre-code genre because many of them are made technically during the pre-code era. So they were trying to figure out how to make a code film since that was a whole new concept.
Yes, because you bring that up. I've seen some from the first half of 34, where it's a Betty Davis movie, I think, that was based on a play where she dies of cholera in the movie, although not specifically. They don't state it specifically what it was, but it was seen as pretty shocking for a code film.
Of human bondage.
That's it.
I believe that may have been a late pre-code. I don't know. It's right from that time where it's hard to tell. But yeah, that's a good point there. The lines began to blur because Joseph Breen became the head of the Studio Relations Committee at the beginning of the year. So his influence was technically part of Hollywood during that time, but he didn't really have the power he would have until the Production Code Administration was actually formed.
Ah, yes, Joseph. Ah, yes, another great Irishman.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really strange to me is that how he actually even got in the movie business in the first place because he was a journalist, I think, originally.
Yes, he was.
But I was just curious as to how he actually even got in the movie business in the first place.
Well, it was quite an interesting story, but it was because of his work as a public relations man. In the late 1920s, he was working as a writer for Martin Quigley, who was a big media mogul in Chicago, but he mainly printed film exhibitors publications. So that's the first Hollywood connection. He also was working with Cardinal Mundelein and had been for the late 20s helping to distribute a movie made about the Eucharist Congress that took place in Chicago. He helped advertise that and they made a movie. And so that's when he started to get in contact with some filmmakers like Mr. Fox. And then he also was working for Stuyvesant Peabody of the Peabody Coal Company. And there was this coal miners' strike in the late 20s, and Joseph Breen went to that strike and talked to the miners and was able to pacify them and after just a few minutes of talking and get them back to work. And Will Hayes, who was known as like the czar of Hollywood, the founder, or at least the first president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, was the lawyer for Stuyvesant Peabody and Peabody Coal Company. So that was when he met Joseph Breen, and he took note of his ability to calm people down, and that's something he really needed in that job in Hollywood. And then it was because of that in 1931 Will Hayes hired him, Mr. Breen, to go out to Hollywood and see what was happening and make a report for him because Will Hayes didn't live in Hollywood. He was in either New York or Washington D.C. a lot of the time. And then Mr. Breen went and stayed in the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel, then wrote him an 8-page memo detailing all the problems and saying that they needed a man of action and a real crusader. And Will Hayes said, "All right, you've got the job." So he then became sort of the public relations man for Hollywood. It was his job to defend the pre-code films to all the censors and the politicians, which is sort of an ironic job for him considering how he would end up being against that kind of filmmaking. But he saw it as a good way to get into the business, and he did a good job at it before eventually becoming the head of the Studio Relations Committee and then the PCA.
You know what's interesting is that the code was named after a man who didn't actually write it himself.
That's true.
And so, can you
Yes.
kind of go into back? Who actually wrote it, though? It was two men.
Yes, it was Father Daniel A. Lord and Martin Quigley, who we mentioned before, who was Mr. Breen's employer. And Martin Quigley really deserves the credit for coming up with the whole idea of it because as early as 1915, I've seen articles in that he wrote in his publication saying the need for some kind of a code because even in those silent films, there was a lot of censorship and it was destroying the movies artistically. So he said in these early articles, if only there was some kind of a code or something to govern film content so that they would be made correctly in the first place, decently, so that they wouldn't need to be censored. And that was his idea. So then, after the scandal of the trial of Mary Dugan in 1929, it was Martin Quigley who calmed down the irate Catholic bishop, Fitzgeorge Dinning, and he said, we shouldn't boycott this movie. Rather, we need to have something which will encourage movies to be made the right way in the first place. So that was when they came up with the idea to actually write the code, and they hired this group of Catholic laymen and businessmen came up with the idea of using Father Daniel Lord as his collaborator because he had worked on a movie earlier. I believe it was King of Kings in the 1920s, and so he had a bit of the Hollywood flair, and he was a writer himself, a fictional writer as well as a nonfiction writer. So together they wrote the motion picture production code and presented it to Will Hayes. But Will Hayes didn't think that the largely Protestant country, although there were a lot of Catholics in America, but as
Hmm.
well as the Jewish filmmakers would like the idea of the document if they knew that it was written by Catholics. So that's why he presented it as his own invention, and hence the name the Hayes Code.
Yep, and you also came up with your own grade of the code films, didn't you? I mean, fair,
Um,
good.
oh yes, yes I did. I did on my blog, the Pure Entertainment Preservation Society. Yeah, I came up with the idea of a good code film, a fair code film, a poor code film, a non-code film, and then the perfect code film. So it's so easy to be critical once you get really familiar with the code to look back and say, oh, well, why did they allow that? Or why did they allow that? But I think a big reason for it wasn't so much they're getting worn down as the fact that there were 8 men, at least, who worked on the PCA at any given time, and Joseph Green was only one of them. And the other 7 weren't always up to his standards of thoroughness and understanding and knowing how to compromise with the filmmakers. Of course, the whole spirit of the code was compromised to work together and find balance that would be pleasing to everybody, since they weren't censors who just reviewed the end film. They worked together to figure out how they could make movies as entertaining as possible while still being, quote, reasonably acceptable to reasonable people.
Yes, and could you give some examples of each grade though? Because that's I was like, what's a good code film?
Oh,
What's a
yeah. All
poor code film? What's a so
right, let
on?
me see if I can think of some. Um, a good code film, I would say most of the Andy Hardy films are definitely good code films. Like, you've got Andy Hardy Gets Spring Fever, or the movie, I actually wrote about this on my blog, but that we'll go with that. Andy Hardy Gives Spring Fever is a good code film. Um, The Youngest Profession from 1943 about girls getting autographs. That's another good code film. Born to Dance from 1936 is a good code film. The perfect code film is something I would say is free from objection, like a good code film, but it includes something extra. Like, they handled a difficult topic really well, and maybe it's extra inspiring. So I'd say Casablanca is a perfect code film because it dealt with some difficult topics. The Chocolate Soldier from 1941 is a good code film. I mean, a perfect code film. The Girl of the Golden West from 1938, which is a musical, is a perfect code film because it deals with this bandit and his story of redemption. A fair code film, it's going to be pretty close to a good code film, but there are 1 or 2 elements that sort of make you raise your eyebrow and say, well, that's not ideal for a code film. Maybe they shouldn't have included that. So I would say, another Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy movie, Sweethearts, is an example of that. There are some strangely risque, there are a couple of sort of risque costumes in it, and a couple of lines that are a little questionable. A horror code film, I'd have to say Gone with the Wind, partly because of the famous 4-letter word,
Yep.
and when the soldier gets shot right in the face, that's pretty violent. Um, obviously, it's compared to how they wanted to make it, they did a great job of making that into a code film, but there are just a few things you kind of wish they could have gone a bit farther. And then non-code film, that's a movie where it just leaves you saying, how on earth is this a Breen era movie? And some good examples are The Adventures of Robin Hood from 1938. There is a lot of violence in that movie with arrows just sticking out of people, some very violent discussion of people's tongues being split and being branded, and probably the most noteworthy is the depiction of the clergy. The code specifically says to not depict the clergy either as villains or comical characters, yet the I believe he's a bishop of some sort, is very evil, and Friar Tuck is comical to the point of being foolish. So that would be a non-code film. There's a whole year that I consider the non-code era, beginning around May of 1941 and lasting to May of 1942, but the impact goes a little longer than that because that was when Joseph Breen actually wasn't the head of the PCA. He quit and went to work for RKO Radio Pictures as the vice president of production and the president of the lot because he was getting frustrated with being just it was such a thankless job, and everyone was criticizing him if he was too strict, criticizing him if he wasn't strict enough. So he said, maybe I can just have one studio to make really good code films. So that was his goal at RKO. But the political upheaval that was happening at that company with Howard Hughes taking over led to his being fired after less than a year, so he went back to work for the PCA. And while he was gone, Jeffrey Sherlock, who was always his second in command, took over unofficially since they couldn't find a good replacement. And during Mr. Breen's absence, many movies released are either like pre-code films or like movies from the late 50s after the Breen era. There are some very shocking instances, and I think that era gives a clear example of the fact that it was not changing times or foreign films that led to the decline of the code in the 50s. It was the absence of Mr. Breen. And probably that some of the best examples of non-code films are I Married an Angel from 1942, The Palm Beach Story from 1942, Two-Faced Woman, also from 1942. Those are the top three, I'd say, but there are a lot more. And you can also see from the big series that MGM was making, the Andy Hardy series and the Dr. Kildare series. In the Andy Hardy series, the movie Andy Hardy's Double Life from 1942 includes some rather surprising sort of slangy dialogue from Andy talking about girls as like sad apples with no shape and being kind of disrespectful to his father, and it's kind of different than what you usually see in an Andy Hardy film. And in Dr. Kildare's Victory, the character of Cookie, the debutante, is rather her manner and her way of speaking to the doctor is reminiscent of pre-code sirens like Jean Harlow. She says some rather suggestive dialogue, sort of discussing the fact that he operated on her and making it more suggestive than it needed to be, as well as a rather graphic description of open heart surgery, which not only is a bit questionable from the code, it also doesn't make sense because Dr. Kildare is a diagnostician and all of a sudden he's performing open heart surgery, so I don't know what happened there. But that's a little bit about the non-code era.
Yeah, and the whole thing about suggestiveness, one actress really comes to mind, Mae West.
Yes, definitely.
I mean, I'm surprised she actually got the majority of what she said in some of those movies past the censors.
That's right.
I mean, one of my favorite movies is My Little Chickadee, and even in that one, she managed to get some lines in.
Yeah. I know she always said her trick was to include 5 things so that she could get 2 things that she wanted through. I don't think she was ever getting anything past the PCI. They knew what was happening, but sometimes it may have just been they reached a compromise and said, "Okay, you can keep that." But it is interesting to note, and maybe Sherlock worked on some of them.
Oh, yes, and he eventually replaced Breen, didn't he?
Yes, he did. In 1954, after Mr. Breen retired, Sherlock did take over and remained the official head of the PCA until 1968 when it was officially replaced with the rating system.
And what do you think, Pop? Do you think he was responsible for the code itself failing?
I do, yes. I think that one of the best ways you can see that is firstly the non-code era and also the how rapidly it declined after Mr. Breen's retirement. By the next year, 1955, you already can see a drastic difference between that and movies made just a year or two earlier. If you can look at the PCA documents, they're actually available, some of them you can see online at the Oscars website. There was sort of a code name system they used because all letters from the PCA were signed Joseph Breen during his tenure, but they would use a system of initials and numbers to indicate who actually wrote the letter. And every time I've sort of felt like, oh, that looks like a non-code movie, and I've been able to find the file for it, I see G, or it's S2 in the corner because it's for Sherlock, and he was second in command. Without fail, several examples of that. And also his ideological background, since he was a theosophist and he was raised in the cult of Lomaland, actually not far from where I live in San Diego. And because of that, he grew up in a society that was very different from the normal American society of the time, and it was known for having some almost satanic views. And the founder of that group was very anti-Christian, whereas the code, you could say, had a strong Christian background, although it wasn't necessarily Christian in nature. But it's hard to know exactly why Sherlock, I believe he's responsible, but I'm not 100% sure why he allowed it to. Okay, was he just bad at the job? Maybe he just was a weak character and he didn't have the strength to uphold things. Maybe he was a little ignorant because he grew up in the society where after grade school the boys and the girls couldn't even talk to each other. They weren't raised in their home. They were kept extremely isolated. So maybe he didn't want to see the bad things, whereas Mr. Breen was in a newspaper room. Clearly he'd had a much more gritty background. Maybe he truly disagreed with the code and he wanted to get rid of it. The best source for finding out a bit into the psyche of Sherlock and what really happened to the PCA is the book See No Evil by Jack Vizard, who was Sherlock's second in command. And in this book, he writes all about his years at the PCA, starting in 1944, going to the very end. And it's so insightful about exactly what these people really were like. And he said that before Mr. Breen even retired in 1951 and 52, Sherlock said that he didn't think the code had a place in Hollywood anymore. He said, "Oh, you fellows know how to handle it now. Don't you know how to enforce the code? We've been trying to show you how to do it almost 20 years. We don't need to stick around." So he was trying to get a petition to get everyone to sign it, all the filmmakers, to get rid of the code. So he seemed like he was just trying to do himself out of a job, and he thought the only way to get rid of the PCA was to make it be ineffective and to not enforce the code properly. He would always say, we don't want to be their nursemaids, we don't want to change their diapers, we don't want to make them do things. So he seemed to think that the film industry should be able to police itself and that the PCA wasn't needed anymore. So it seems to me that that could be a reason why he wanted to abolish the code. He just thought that it wasn't necessary anymore, or that not so much abolish the code, but the PCA, that the filmmakers should be able to make their own decisions and not need any help of like a policeman. So he's an interesting character. He never wrote a memoir, unfortunately, but Vizard's book does give some insight into what he was thinking. In some ways, I give Vizard more blame for the end of the code because he came from more of a similar background to Mr. Breen. He was actually training to be a Jesuit priest before he then left the seminary after 13 years and went to the PCA. And he believed very strongly in the ideas of the code, but after hanging around in Hollywood for a while and associating with Sherlock and the filmmakers, he began to doubt whether he believed in the code or the idea of the PCA or even believed in God. And eventually he did leave all kind of faith and became sort of a humanist, I don't know. But he was upset that he wasn't made the head of the PCA upon Mr. Breen's retirement. According to his nephew, he never really got over that. And that could be why he was trying to take down the PCA, because he makes it pretty clear in his book that he vowed to take down the PCA, and he also tried to take down the Legion of Decency, particularly through Martin Quigley, who was, he called him the tail that wagged the dog. He controlled the Legion of Decency quite a bit, even though he wasn't officially on the board. And he did intentionally get Martin Quigley out of that position. Whether he was responsible or not is a debatable point, but he did try. So he and Sherlock together are sort of like the two sides of the coin of the people who are responsible for the end of the code.
And after that, all heck broke loose, to say the least.
Yes, yes, it did.
You got movies like Psycho, The 7 Year Itch, which was all within a 5 year period, I think, after that happened.
That's right. You got the 7 Year Itch was in 1955, so right after Mr. Breen retired. Psycho was 1961. Yeah, 1961. So not, again, not that long after the end of Mr. Breen, and the code was still technically in place when those movies were released. Then a few years later, you have movies like The Pawnbroker, 1963, with female toplessness and very graphic imagery depicting the Holocaust, and they allowed it, and they said this isn't setting a precedent. This is just because it's about the Holocaust, but obviously it was setting a precedent. They always would say this isn't a precedent, but it was. You can't allow one filmmaker to have out and out nudity or say certain words in a movie and think that the others aren't going to say, well, because he did it, I should be able to do it too. And from Vizar's book, it's very obvious that they definitely did that, and it was a pretty rapid descent, but it's amazing how long it took them to actually get rid of the code, considering how quickly the content declined.
Yes, and one thing that's even crossed my mind, I don't know if Americans could have won the war if it weren't for the production code.
I've thought that many times myself. I don't think we could have.
I mean, because seeing there, I mean, if it's a contemporary piece in the 40s and the main character was not in the war, there was an explanation given
That's right.
for it.
Yeah, there was very anti-American and unpatriotic, a lot of pacifism in the pre-code films, but the having those few years of the code to kind of boost public morale and make people feel more patriotic, even leading up to the war, then led people to be able to really bond together to fight a common enemy, and the PCA did play a big part in that. The Joseph Breen was actually on a few councils that were related to the government on how do we depict the military, war information. They were all the PCA members were on these boards because it was very important. And it's a good thing that Mr. Breen got back to the PCA as early as he did in 1942 because it wouldn't have been good having Jeff in charge throughout the war.
Ah, yes, old Jeff.
Hmm.
Again, the subject of the decline, I mean, I definitely saw a big change in those 5 years, like you said. Another thing that really shocked me was that the scene in Psycho where Janet Leigh is tearing up the bill, I think, and then flushing it.
Yes, that was shocking at the time, but it wasn't the first time that a toilet had been shown on screen, as some thought, or even during even in a Sherlock era film. I know there's at least one movie called I think it's called No Time for Sergeants,
With Andy
starring
Griffith.
a yeah, and there are toilets in that movie.
Okay, so I don't know. I guess the Guinness Book of World Records was wrong because it's listed as the first time a toilet was shown in a film in the Guinness Book of World Records.
Yeah, I have to say Guinness is wrong on that point, and I would be inclined, I can't think of an example, but I'd be inclined to say there must be some pre-code film where a toilet is shown. I can't think of one, but they're
Well, I know that there were a few where ladies were shown in the bathtub.
yes, definitely.
Oh
So
yes,
several.
and I know that you're trying to get the code reinstated hopefully one day, which is something I've been rooting for.
Yeah, that's been my campaign for several years.
But do you think it will ever be reinstated at this point?
I don't know. It seems like it's so far gone, but the one thing that is positive is that the organization which made it possible in the first place is still in existence. The Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, although it's now just called the Motion Picture Association. Because the biggest, I don't know, criticism people have for the whole idea is that there are so many indies now. Where's the organization? It was the breakdown of the studio system that led to the end of the code. But the big studios of the 1950s are the same big studios that are the big studios today. So if Hollywood could be persuaded to believe that they would make more money if they would organize under the code, I believe that it could be instated again. Maybe as more of an optional thing this time, so that it would be an alternative film industry, and then maybe the others would see that it does better if people can all go to if the whole family will go to the movie, it's better for business.
I know, and I've always thought that the rating system has always been flawed. I mean, there are
Yes, it
things in
has.
children's movies that look like they should be in adult movies, for example, and vice versa.
Yes, yes, there are. And the whole concept of, especially under the rating system, the concept of the children's film has become it's got to be really dumb, really immature, and that there can't be just an intelligent family film. There are some, of course, but not that many. And there really aren't that many clean or family-friendly movies which have been made under the rating system. The whole idea of it is that it's you can have a choice, but there isn't much choice when the majority of the big films have been R-rated, especially in recent years. I think it shows what a flawed system it is that Steven Spielberg had to suggest the idea of the PG-13 rating. For the first 15 years, there was just G, PG, originally GP, and then right to R. And that's why there are so many movies from the 70s and early 80s that are like, that's PG, especially because PG is now considered a children's rating. But there wasn't any other option if they weren't bad enough to be R. So then he's after Raiders of the Lost Ark, not Raiders, the second one, Temple of
That
Doom
yeah, that's right.
was so,
Temple of
and
Doom.
Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom was so
Hmm.
violent, and it was shocking because like, oh, this is a children's film. And then his other movie, Gremlins, from the same year, had a similar problem. He said, well, why don't we create a new rating, the PG-13? So that but it doesn't solve the problems of the things that are included in PG films. They don't even know what a G film is anymore. It's been so long since a G film was released because they're afraid to say anything is completely acceptable. And things which they include in R-rated films now, as some have noted, would have been strictly in the X rating a few decades back.
I wonder why they took that letter out.
I understand it's because it was too associated with pornography,
Okay,
and
yes,
they
that makes sense.
so they decided to replace it with NC-17, not admitted under the age of 17. And almost no movie theaters will even play a movie that has that rating, so most filmmakers will do whatever cuts they have to stay within R, which isn't too much because they'll let a lot of really bad things be in R-rated films.
Don't I know it? And Disney, I think, has probably been on a steady decline for the last 10 years.
Yes, yes, they have.
I mean, they used to make family films. Now they're turning out nothing but remakes and sequels. And I'm glad to see we both have the same opinion on the latest Indiana Jones movie.
Oh yes. Yeah, it's true. And how they used to, well, their Renaissance films are all rated G, even though a lot of them really shouldn't be because they included some rather questionable things. But nowadays they make their latest like Pixar movies. If I try braining these movies and go through and saying, okay, what would have been removed? The Renaissance movies are just full of problems. I can list 50, 60 problems. Yet the basic core message was more of a good versus evil, more of a wholesome message. As opposed to the latest Pixar films, it's hard to pinpoint individual things that you could actually cut. There's less bathroom humor, less suggestive like costumes, if you will. Yet there's something deeply flawed about the whole worldview that they depict. To just really, and also the less intelligent. So there's less of a good versus evil. It's more just kind of messes with your brain and lacking the quality that the films used to have.
Yeah, in regards to family films, another thing that this has definitely been under my skin for quite a while, and at least in regards to family shows and family movies, father is always depicted as a moron,
That's true, and
usually.
it's very sad because the strong father influence is very important in children's development. But they just don't lose any time to any chance they can make fun of fathers in modern entertainment. Such a far cry from in the old code films, you have such wonderful examples of fathers who are loving and good heads of the family.
You got that right. Well, I'm sorry, but I'm afraid I'm gonna have to let you go now, Tiffany. Think I'm about ready to wrap this up. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure speaking with you, Luke.
Pleasure speaking with you as well.